tonight I'm going to focus on something that's just emerging in the United States, but it will have tremendous relevance where Canada is concerned. So what is emerging in the United States, our large neighbor to the south, is truly amazing. The major media in Europe and Canada and the United States is spinning everything about Trump in a certain way. The narrative and the axiom the media is operating on, which they're trying to induce the population or anyone to have, is that Trump is a buffoon, he's incompetent, he's a disgrace to the presidency, a crude huckster, an entertainer, a person with no inner soul or conscience, corrupt, a capitalist pig who wants to rape the environment and support the oil companies, racist, a woman hater, and he only won the election because of Vladimir Putin and Russian hacking, and is nothing but a stooge of an aggressive, expansionist, murderous thug, Vladimir Putin, who wants to rebuild the Soviet Empire and dominate the world. That's the narrative. Okay? And everything seems to be spun towards reinforcing this narrative and so forth. And it is true that I believe that a significant portion of the population in Europe, Canada, and the United States especially, believe this to some degree or not. However, it is not universal, and it is not a majority per se that believe. Perhaps it might be close to a simple majority, but I don't know. Now I find this very remarkable, and I find it uniform and unrelenting. But is Trump really what is being put forward here? To others, the so-called deplorables, he is the guy who represents their rage at the system. Still, to others, he is Wall Street's dream come true. And to even others, he is the new sheriff who's going to stand tough to those threatening America, ISIS, illegals, China, and those foreigners who have taken advantage of the United States. So the question I pose is there something more happening that is being missed by both the major media, which has gone berserk, and most of those who still support or think they support Donald Trump? And yes, there is. And something that has begun to faintly emerge and starting to sound more firm, like the notes of a motif of a new symphony, which most likely will become stronger and stronger, is emerging. And part of what I'm going to talk about tonight is that motif. Okay, what I'm going to go through are some of the notes that have been played by Trump, no pun intended, that outline a very different composition, and some reactions to those notes indicate further the outline of this composition and some historical background to this composition. If seen from this perspective of this emerging new symphony, Trump's behavior as president has a very different meaning than from the mainstream media or even from his various supporters. So I'll just give you some of the notes. In his Willow Point address, he called on a second industrial revolution for the United States, referencing the American model. He called it the American model. and Lincoln being the first industrial revolution. He rejected free trade and called for fair trade and reciprocity. He called for the United States to believe in America, to believe in the American worker, and he called for bringing all of the manufacturing back to the United States. And also that there must be respect for foreign investors coming to rebuild U.S. industries, and mainly he's referring to China and Japan. Then the following week at Louisville, he referenced a native son of Louisville, Henry Clay. And to quote, Henry Clay believed in what he called the American system. He proposed tariffs to protect American industry and finance American infrastructure. Now, okay, the very next day, last Wednesday, at the fundraiser for the Republican National Congressional Committee, he discussed the American system once again, and I'm going to read the quotes on that. Hang on one second. Oh, shoot. I should have set this up earlier. Give me a second here. Okay, he said, I have called this model, the model that you've been watching, the model that has created so much value, the model of bringing back jobs and bringing back industry. I call it the American model. This is the system that our founders wanted, our great American leaders. They all agreed that for America to be a strong nation, it must also be a great manufacturing nation. The Republican platform of 1896, more than a century ago, stated that protection and reciprocity are twin measures of American policy and go hand in hand. We have situations where other countries who have zero respect for our country and so forth. And he goes into that. He says it's not going to happen anymore. And our first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, ran his first campaign for public office in 1832 when he was only 23 years old. He began by imagining the benefits a railroad could bring to this part of Illinois without ever having seen a steam-powered train. He had no idea, and yet he knew what it could be. 30 years later, as president, Lincoln signed the law that built the Transcontinental Railway, uniting our country from ocean to ocean. You know, great president, blah, blah, blah. Does anyone know? A lot of people don't know that Lincoln was a Republican. We have to build up a little bit more. And then he says, in another great Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower, had a vision of a national infrastructure plan. He traveled across the country, etc., along, call it the Lincoln Highway. Okay, so then he said, more than 3 decades later as president, he signed a bill that created our great interstate highway. So he's still 3 decades later from when he traveled around the country, once again uniting us as a nation. Now it is time for a new Republican administration working with a Republican Congress to pass the next great infrastructure bill. Okay. Okay, so give me 1 second here.
So, Boyd, can you put up the links to these speeches?
Huh?
Can you put up links to these speeches you just cited?
No, I can't, not right now, no.
No, not now.
So, but I can send it out to you.
Okay.
I can send it out to you. Okay. Okay. So, now, Lyndon LaRouche, who watched these two presentations, he said Trump is not saying this for political advantage. He's talking about the specifics of the American or American system, essentially something which is completely unknown to his audience. Both the masses in one case and Republican activists and fundraisers. This is totally not known to them. And why is he saying this? Because he really means it. There is no political advantage to it. Now, the American system of Lincoln, Clay, and Henry Carey, who was the advisor to Lincoln, had three basic components to it, or pillars. One was protection and reciprocity in trade to make sure that manufacturing infrastructure could develop, industrial manufacturing could develop. Two, national credit through the form of a national banking. And use the power of government to bring about internal improvements and scientific breakthroughs. And then this morning, Trump had a 5-minute video. He has a little video every Saturday morning. And this one was on the space program and the vision of America going into space in the context of us signing the national NASA bill, and talking about the world that we have not discovered. So we know very little about our universe, and we need to discover it. Now, what's happening here is that these are not the notes that Americans have traditionally, in the last period, as far as I can remember, have heard from presidents or major candidates. No one has talked like this since McKinley. We did a research on this, and it was McKinley, President McKinley, William McKinley, who last had discussed this with the population. After he was assassinated, there has not been any discussion of this since. And it wasn't until Franklin Delano Roosevelt that somebody representing this point of view came into office. So you have a 32-year span since the assassination of McKinley and the inauguration of FDR that you don't have any discussion of this. And you have an entirely different policy of an empire of filibustering, sending troops into Latin America, into Central America. You have an entirely different policy where the United States is now participating with the British colonial system, not opposing it, not trying to undermine it. And those 32 years were a period of time in which much of the memory of the American system was lost to a generation and a half. So, and when FDR came on the scene, he did not use that as his reference point. He used a different reference point, which was the good neighbor policy, the four freedoms, you know, community of sovereign nations, but he didn't have this articulated American system, though he did follow it completely. He was a student of Alexander Hamilton, but it was not referenced in this way by FDR. Now, it's also the case that the LaRouche movement, based on LaRouche's economic ideas, made a discovery that there was such a thing as the American system, and that it was, that it existed. So that's now 90 years or so after, or almost 90 years after McKinley. It was discovered. And the discovery was made because we couldn't make sense of the Marxist viewpoint and the communist viewpoint. We were a Marxist connect. Well, we weren't quite fully Marxist, but we were kind of Marxist at the time, and we couldn't understand how the United States become such an industrial giant based upon Marxist theory or based on free market theory or any other kind of theory that was in existence at that time. So this was a discovery that was made. But it was made because of LaRouche's economic ideas about the application of science, scientific breakthroughs to economic development. And and then since that time, we have been publishing or reviving the Careys, McKinley, Lincoln, Carey's father, Matthew Carey, Alexander Hamilton, all of the principal figures of the 18th century, 19th century who were active in this. E. Pershing Smith, who went to Japan, and others. We've been, and then those elements, and then their co-thinkers in other parts of the world at the end of the 19th century. Now, now, does Trump know about us and our work and all of that? Well, I don't know. But it is probable, and this is me speaking, that Trump on his own studied the history of the economic rise and decline of the United States. And because he was not an academic or a politician, and because he was financially independent, he did not have to deal with ideological issues. So I think he probably approached this from the standpoint of his own individual study. I do not think that this is coming from his advisors. I do not think he has around him any advisors who necessarily represent this perspective. I think this is a personal perspective that is emerging that he has personally, not those surrounding him. There may be like this guy Bannon has this Generation Zero video out there, and it's off. I mean, he picks up some aspects of this, but it's off. It's a cyclical, every 4 generations there's a revolution kind of thing. It's off. So now I'm going to quote from, and I've quoted this before, from Henry Carey, who was Lincoln's principal economic advisor, and the principal advisor later to Bismarck, and Bismarck's economic development, economic policies, and he was also associated with Friedrich List, the economist, who was
Paul?
Yeah.
Could you make an honorable mention of the American system advocate in Russia?
Oh yeah, and the American system correspondent in Russia was a Count Vidi, who was the Witte, who was one of the top ministers there at the end of the same period. So this is a quote from the book by Henry Carey called Harmony of Interest. And this is written in the late 1850s. And he's saying the following: 2 systems are before the world. The one looks to increasing the proportion of persons and of capital engaged in trade and transportation, and therefore diminishing the proportion engaged in producing commodities with which to trade, with necessarily diminishing return to the labor of all, while the other looks to increasing the proportion engaged in the work of production and diminishing that engaged in trade and transportation, with increased return to all, giving the laborer good wages and to the owner of capital good profits. Okay. One looks to the increasing quantity of raw materials to be exported and diminishing the inducements to the import of men, thus impoverishing both farmer and planter by throwing on them the burden of freight, while the other looks to increasing the importation of men and diminishing the export of raw materials, thereby enriching both planter and farmer by relieving them of the payment of freight. One looks to compelling the farmers and planters of the Union to continue their contributions to the support of the fleets and armies, the paupers, the nobles, and the sovereigns of Europe. The other to enabling ourselves to supply the same means to the moral and intellectual improvements of the sovereigns of America. One looks to the continuance of that bastard freedom of trade which denies the principle of protection yet doles out as revenue duties. The other to extend the area of legitimate free trade by the establishment of perfect protection. Followed by the annexation of individuals and communities, and ultimately by the abolition of custom houses. One looks to exporting men to occupy desert tracts, the sovereignty of which is obtained by the aid of diplomacy or war. The other to increasing the value of immense extent of vacant land by importing men by millions for their occupation. One looks to increasing the necessity for commerce, the other to increasing the power to maintain it. One looks for underworking the Hindu and sinking the rest of the world to his level, the other to raising the standard of man through the world to our level. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism, the other increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, combination of action, and civilization. One looks towards universal war, the other towards universal peace. One is the English system, the other we may be proud to call the American system, for it is the only one ever devised, the tendency of which was that of elevating while equalizing the conditions of man throughout the world. So if Trump is talking about the American system, the only context in which this has been used in the past is in context to the then existing British Empire, or what was said there, the English system. Now, so this is quite new, and how this is going to develop is not clear, but it's very clear that this is what Trump is talking about. This is what he's doing, and that he's talking to a population that has no idea what this is, and he's talking to a Republican political machine that has no idea what this is, and yet he's doing it. Now, what's interesting is that this system, the American system, is coherent with a multipolar world. It's not hegemonic. You lead by example. You don't lead by sending your armies all over the world. So what he's saying is coherent with what a multipolar world would be like. I mean, at least if he's pushing the American system. If he's saying that this is what we're, and what does he say? Protection and reciprocity. Meaning, we sit down and we work out what's in our mutual interests. Reciprocal. Otherwise, we put huge tariffs on things. Now, as the media clamor for overthrowing the results of the election on the alleged fact that Trump is a Putin, a traitorous Putin toady, and as many Republicans and McCainites and neocons and others rail at the injustices economically that China has caused the United States, what is Trump doing in foreign policy wise, and what is a coherent, is this foreign policy that's emerging, which is still, it hasn't really emerged, but it's starting to emerge, is it coherent with the policy of protectionism, reciprocity in the American system. So let's look at Tillerson's trip to China. He wouldn't bring the American media on board. So what you learn about what was actually said and what he said in a press conference or what he said in China, you can only find from the Chinese media. Okay, but he did mention that the United States and China need a win-win strategy. Okay, that's what Xi Jinping said. And should look at their relationship over the next 50 years. Well, that's the way China sees things over the next 50 years. So Tillerson is saying that the relationship between the United States and China should be win-win, and they should look towards where you're going to go 50 years from now. If you looked at Trump's speech today, he's talking about a future in space. That's a future. So, is that coherent? Now, the reports that the media gives about this trip are totally different. Now, supposedly, and it's not made official, and I have no idea why it's not made official, Xi Jinping expected to meet with Trump in Florida, in Mar-a-Lago, I think it's called, for 2 days. Now, what are they going to be talking about? They're going to be talking about probably massive, massive Chinese investments in the United States. That's what I suspect.
You'd all that American money they've got.
Exactly. Right. And so this is going to be the pivot of America's future. Is going to be a China-U.S. partnership. And what about our other partner, the U.S. other partner, that up until now it has been joined at the hip with Great Britain and Canada and New Zealand and Australia and the Five Eyes and all of that. What about that? Well, I think that is going to come to an end. And of course, usually that's a good reason for assassinating somebody, but that's going to come to an end. And this is going to have a big effect on Canada, because the United States is not going to most likely be the good friend of. If they're going with the American system, they're not going to be the good friend in that sense with this other system. So is that coherent? I don't know. We have to wait and see. But this seems to be where Trump is saying this is my idea of how we developed in the past. This is my idea of how we have to go in the future. And most people have no idea what this is about, except the people that we've been talking to for years on the street. You know, our contacts we have, and people that we've been talking to for many years have no idea what this is about. Now, after the meeting in China, after the meeting in Florida, Tillerson will be there. Tillerson is supposed to go to Moscow and meet with the Russians, and he's bypassing, it appears, the NATO Foreign Minister Summit, which everybody's screaming about. And so, what do the Russians think about all this? Now, you know, the Russians are very. They have a somewhat pessimistic culture. I'll just put it that way. They've been through a lot, you know. Things have been rough.
Not necessary. Not necessary.
Not necessarily.
They're cautious.
They're cautious.
Yeah.
Cautious.
Yeah.
So they're not jumping on Trump's bandwagon. But anyhow,
I will have something to say about that.
huh?
I will have something to say about that later when you stop.
Okay. So there was a presentation that Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia gave to the General Staff College. And, you know, he's explaining the situation in this with the military and what the Russian military's policies are. And, you know, we're not promoting any ideologies. We're not trying to run the world. We're trying to preserve sovereignty of nations. You know, we don't care what your ideology is, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He's going through the United Nations, why you have to work within the United Nations, in spite of problems with the United Nations, and so forth and so on. And then he talks about the situation with the U.S., which is not very positive. But then he says, historical traditions should also be mentioned among the factors that determine a nation's role in world politics. History is the memory of states, said Henry Kissinger, the theoretical practitioner of international relations. By the way, the United States, whose interest Mr. Kissinger has always defended, did not aspire to be the center of the liberal world order for a greater part of its own fairly short history. And it did not see that role as its preeminent mission. Its founding fathers wanted its leadership and exceptional nature to derive from its own positive example. Ironically, the American elite, which emerged as freedom fighters and separatists anxious to cast off the yoke of the British crown, had transformed itself and its state by the 20th century into a power thirsting for global imperialist domination. The world is changing, however. And who knows? America might yet purify itself and return to its own forgotten sources. That's a cautious statement, but it's echoing the possibility that there could be a change in the United States. And it's a big issue. Now, I will say that, you know, I'm not looking at this. Some people may accuse me of looking at this with rose-colored glasses, but I'm just saying this is not we have not heard this from anybody since McKinley.
McKinley was?
President.
He initiated the imperial phase.
He was elected in
1896.
and then later in the year 1900.
And
I thought McKinley was the one that initiated the imperial phase. They had the Spanish-American War 2 years later, of course.
Yeah.
Organized that.
There was an imperial faction already well underway in before his presidency and going into his presidency, and it was centered around Wall Street. It was centered around Morgan Rockefeller,
Right.
you know, so forth. But they were always connected to the British, and this is sort of began with that, and but it really took a turn for the worse after he was killed.
When was he killed?
1901.
And he was assassinated, correct?
He was assassinated, yes,
Some boneheaded anarchist.
by a so-called anarchist. And the anarchist had slept on the night or two before with Emma Goldman in New York, and she had to leave the United States, but she was celebrated throughout Great Britain. But anyhow, but that assassination shifted everything into full-scale empire. That was the full-scale American empire took off with Roosevelt. Although I'm sure the beginnings were occurring, you know, prior to Roosevelt. And so now, how this relates to Canada, you know, we're discussing this. We don't have a final say on this or what have you. But I'm expecting that there will be a tendency for the provinces, for economic and other reasons, to make their own agreements, and that essentially you could see the breakup of Canada. Not necessarily joining the United States per se, but you could see the breakup of Canada. And also, you could see the breakup of the United Kingdom, with Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland no longer being part of the United Kingdom. And that's very possible. Because when you seek to rule through compartmentalization, you also leave open the prospect of disintegration, that you will disintegrate into pieces. And so we're looking at this situation now, so that if you have this process developing in the United States, where the United States is making China its partner in development, then, and the empire is going down, and then you have a situation in Europe. Now, I don't know if people have heard what happened. Marine Le Pen went to Russia. She went to talk to Putin.
Yeah.
And she's telling the French and the Europeans, I don't care what you call me. Yeah, I'm going to talk to Putin. And she said, we need to have better relations with Russia. We need to end the sanctions. We need to have economic cooperation for France. And we need to get out of the European Union. And she will most likely make it to the runoff. The polls are running neck and neck between her and Macron, who is the imperial institutional representative of the French elite, of the Rothschilds and everything else. And they're running neck and neck. And so the election is in about, what, 3 to 4 weeks? 3 weeks maybe? The French first round. We have there are 11 candidates running. We have one running. Jacques Cheminade, he's his third. So he'll be putting some ideas into the campaign, into the election. He'll be getting time. He's being attacked massively by the media, but he's running on our policies in France. And in the runoff between Macron and Le Pen, the conservative Catholic base in the rural areas and so forth of Fillon, who similarly he similarly had a anti-sanctions policy with Russia, and he won the primary against his opponent, who was expected to win. I forgot the name of that.
Sarkozy.
Huh?
Sarkozy? Well,
No. Sarkozy, and there was one other one.
Yeah.
Yeah, he defeated both of them now, and then he's come under attack, under massive attack. So but it looks like his political base may split, and a good chunk of them could go to Marine Le Pen, and the leftists and socialists, they control a good chunk together, the Communist Party and the Socialist Party. And again, you might have a Bernie Sanders effect, where they just, some of them are just going to go.
You were cool, right?
Yeah, the leadership will say vote for Macron, that the base will shift. So she could win the presidency, and if she wins the French presidency, there will be no European Union. It's over. Because if France leaves if Britain is leaving and the French leave, then what's left? Germany. And the Germans will have to carry it on their own, and there's things happening there, and Robbie said there's things happening. So that's playing into the situation.
Hungary's almost left already.
Yeah, Hungary's almost left.
And Poland is also, they're unhappy.
The Polish are very
about
unhappy.
some quite a few stuff.
Yeah,
They want to Tusk out.
yeah.
They've been supporting.
Yeah, their own guy, they didn't want to be the president. So, I don't know, should we bring Valentina up now, or should we answer a few questions?
Sure, do you want,
No, I just wanted to tell you something about Russia. I don't think they're that passive Putin is doing a lot of stuff
Tight.
quietly. Like right now, Americans accusing Russia for getting involved in Afghanistan. And they're saying they're supporters of Taliban. Taliban is on a list of, what do you call them, terrorist organization. But what Russia is doing, they're having a conference with India, with China, with former Soviet Eastern republics, how to deal with Afghanistan, how to deal with drug trafficking.
Iran too.
Iran too, yeah. So they invited the United States, but the United States said no, they didn't know about the policy. So what Russia feels that right now, the Obama apparatchiks, what they will call it, apparatus, is moving country still in the same direction as previously. They're thinking of putting another sanctions on Russia. They're discussing. The Russians were not quite sure, but they're talking that they were not punished enough for Crimea. So U.S. is thinking of imposing sanctions. What Russia is hoping, they're hoping that once Trump stabilizes himself, he might have different policy. So, I mean, as soon as the White House heard about Foreign Secretary going to Russia, they start saying he cannot do that. That's not right. He's supposed to go to Russia on April 6th and 7th. I don't know if he's going or not.
No, after a week after.
Or maybe a week after. But they were trying to stop him. So
Right.
I don't know if he'll be going and what not.
Okay.
So Putin basically is hoping that once everything in place and once Trump is thrown on his feet, the policy may change. But at the same time, they're saying if it doesn't, we're going to do what we're doing now. We're going to get behind U.S. back, or they're going to connect with other countries. They're going to work on connection with East, but at the same time they're still talking to opposition blocs everywhere in Europe as well. So I think Putin has his feet strongly on the ground and he knows what he's doing.
Right. Hold on, and I'm just going to say a few things on that. Yeah, and it was the NATO general with the Italian name came to the Congress demanding there be much upgrade of NATO and funding and all of this to the Congress. They went to the Congress. They didn't go to Trump. They went to the Congress, right? So this is where the big thing is, and so the stakes are very high, especially with Afghanistan, because that's where the key part of the financial system is centered on the heroin trade that comes out of Afghanistan. And,
Drugs.
yeah, and the Taliban has been reorganized by Obama to a large degree. Some of them got their training in Guantanamo and then got released in exchange for whatever, the top leadership, and then they're back in the business there. So Obama's had a very close relationship, the Obama administration has a very close relationship behind the scenes with the Taliban all this time. So the stakes are very high. The stakes are very, very high, and the situation is not stable. It's not stable. That's the whole point. But there are indications that Trump wants to move out of the control of the British system. And what I mean by that is not the financial system as such, but I mean out of this this structure of, they're the enemy, we're the free world, they're the this world, and that whole narrative. And he's moving also out of the whole narrative of the climate change thing. And he's also moving out of the whole narrative of the libertarian, no government, legalized drugs. He's moving out of that whole dimension. So you've got these three different kinds of, and George Soros is involved in all three. He's financing all three of these different, but these are like, they set up a, left-right is another example. They set up all these things where you have essentially two different things, and you define yourself by your opposition to the other. And so the opposition to the other defines you. And this really is what, and from my point of view, when the United States, and I'm not talking about the elites in the United States, but I'm talking about the population, the transformation that the population went, where they lost their sense of soul, where they lost their soul as as Americans. The actual soul of Americans started after World War II. Following the dropping of the two atom bombs and the lie that was told about that, and then then the Cold War, and then the McCarthyism. And I know this personally, that what emerged was a hysteria where Americans became xenophobic, and they began to define themselves as us versus them, us versus the communists, and it was enforced by the FBI. And so this is still the dominant, this has still been the dominant mentality in certain circles of the United States. Other mentalities have emerged, but that's been a key factor. So the question is, what is an American in a positive sense? Is an American a free marketeer? Is an American, going to impose democracy on the world, our values? Is an American somebody that's against them, against the communists, against the foreigners? No, you can't, if Trump is serious about doing anything, he cannot operate on that basis. He has to introduce a new concept of what an American, this is my view. He has to introduce a new concept of what a positive conception of what an American is, which is not those things, not the reactive, not the reactivity that you get. So that's my view. That if he wants to actually change the United States, he has to do that. He has to begin to organize the population around a different conception. The space program, we're going to go into space, scientific, technological development, and a different identity of, we could be great, we could do this, and so on. So I think that's what he's trying to do. Whether he's going to be successful or not is another story.